So the first category that we're actually going to look at is the carbohydrates one, and it's actually a huge category. As we've seen before, it includes your grains, grain products, all your sugar and your sweeteners, your pulses, lentils and beans, but also your vegetables and fruit. So remember, a lot of people always get surprised when we say, what do you mean fruit and vegetables are carbohydrates? Yes, they are. Predominantly they're carbs. Of course, it's the type of carbs and the ingredients and what are in them that is very different to your other kind of carbs, such as grain products. And the beauty about it is that each of these actually brings different ingredients that the body needs at certain times. We could say, as a general rule, that the more supported carbs tend to be those that are quite high in fibers, quite high in vitamins, antioxidants, a lot of nutrients basically, including your anti inflammatory phytonutrients. And we could say that some of your other carbs that are really, really high in calories but don't really have many nutrients, they're not as supportive. Obviously in terms of looking at a general health level for a body and what nutrients a food can sort of offer. Some of these carbs that are a bit less supportive and have very high calorie can affect blood sugar levels and increase blood sugar levels hugely. And as I mentioned before, if they're not rich in nutrients, then obviously they're offering less nutrition to the body. So there's an expression that says that you can have empty calories. So that's things like your certain foods that are really, really high tend to be more in the sweet category, like your um, ice creams and cakes and those kinds of things that can have lots of calories but very little nutrition that is actually offered to the body through that food. That's why they're called empty calories. So we really, in terms of a nutrition perspective and in terms of what the body requires, we want to be focusing on foods that are actually rich in nutrients. So the body's getting all the antioxidants, all the vitamins, all the minerals, and all the fiber that it needs. So some of these less nutritious carbs, if you like, still play a role in the diet. But as mentioned, it needs to be explored for each individual. And it's basically clear that we want to be offering more supportive and quality carbs over ones that are not so supportive for us. So let's have a look at these carbohydrates. And we're going to start off with grains to begin with. Okay, so our first section that we're going to look at is the grains, as mentioned. What we've done here is we've drawn a table here. You can see there's two sides to the table. There's the left-hand side and the right-hand side. It's not to say that foods need to be categorized this way, but this is just one particular approach and one way of considering foods within the category of grains. So you'll see one side tends to talk about the grains that are generally supportive. Again, I've put generally in there because this can vary from person to person. And then, of course, you've got other grains as well there, which are ones that can tend to be a bit problematic for some people. But before we go into the depth of looking at those, I just want to cover a little bit around the grains in terms of what does it mean when we talk about grains. So grains, in this particular case means it's a grain that hasn't been processed. It is the whole grain. So we're talking about a grain of rice, yeah, or a quinoa grain, or other grains like buckwheat, millet, spelt, bulgur, wheat, any of those. So that means it's the whole, it's like buying a packet of rice. It hasn't been ground down into flour. It hasn't been used to make any bread by being ground down first into flour. This is when we're talking about the pure raw grain itself that has not been processed. It's a very big difference in how the body actually welcomes and utilizes a grain that hasn't been processed versus a grain that has been processed. So you take a rice grain or quinoa grain or seed, as some people call it, or anything else. When you cook that up, it actually has still its casing around it. It's got its fiber. It brings certain nutrients to the body in a different package compared to when the dried grain has been milled into flour and then you bake a bread from it. So what we find is that the raw unprocessed grains, when they're then cooked, are actually more nutritious in many ways to the body in terms of the package of ingredients that it actually brings, particularly when we're dealing with things like fiber. So if we look at the grains on the left-hand side of the table there that are quality grains that are generally supportive, We're dealing with some which are actually like a seed essentially. So quinoa, amaranth, and buckwheat are all gluten-free and they're technically seeds rather than grains. You've also got millet, sorghum, and teff, which are other forms of gluten-free grains. The teff and the sorghum are a little bit harder to get a hold of. Teff in particular is harder to get a hold of, and some of these are not always easy to cook with, though if of course you're from a tradition such as the Ethiopian tradition where they use teff a lot, and it's quite a high protein grain too, then obviously there's going to be a bit of knowledge in how to use those more easily with cooking. The remainder of the grains on that side is the barley, oats, rye, and kamut. You tend not to eat them so much in terms of the grains themselves, but keep in mind that all of these do contain gluten. So if you're aiming to go gluten free, then these are grains you'd want to be avoiding. Note that oats is also, it contains gluten. In other words, it contains oat gluten, which has a very similar effect to normal gluten, wheat gluten, in terms of our effect on the inflammatory pathways of the body. So even though you're buying oats that are gluten-free, that's just advertising that they are free from wheat gluten, but they certainly have their oat gluten in them as well. Then what you've got is you've got your wild rice. So again, it's more of a grass rather than a grain itself, and it's not really rice itself. And it has twice the amounts of protein and fiber than brown rice. So wild rice is actually quite expensive to get, but it does have a lot more of your phytonutrients in it than your normal rice. And same with your colored rices as well. They tend to have a lot of phytonutrients in them as well. So you can see I've put a little note there on the bottom saying grains such as quinoa, amaranth, and buckwheat are particularly high in protein, vitamin, and fiber content, are generally more supported than your gluten-containing grains. Just a general approach here. On the right-hand side, you've got other grains. With this, we've actually put rice, whether it's brown or white, because we found that research is showing that there's a lot of blood sugar level issues that can arise from consumption of too much rice. So a little bit every now and then, and depending on how it's obviously consumed, like in sushis or other areas, it can be fine for a lot of people. But there are people who will start reacting to the rice and will need to sort of gradually minimize that. Again, it's a specialty area. You need to work with a nutritionist or a dietitian around that. Someone who has got a background in understanding what works best for your body to support you with your diet. We've also got the wheat, spelt, triticale, bulgur in there. These are here predominantly because they are gluten-containing grains. So just so you're aware of that, that obviously can contribute significantly to inflammation in the body, hence why they've been put in that category. It doesn't mean you can't eat them, it just means that you need to be aware that some of these can create significant problems for some people. I've popped corn in there as well. Now, corn is not really a grain, but it's often used or seen as a grain. And as we'll see in the next category of grain products, it's often used to make corn wraps and things like that. So corn can be a little bit more sweet, more starchy. Again, for some people can create some problems. And corn is often a common allergen as well. So that's why I've put it in this category of other grains. Not that you can't eat it, but obviously in terms of an allergy picture and reactivity picture, you need to be aware that that can cause some problems. We also have a little note I've put in there on the bottom that explains that some grains are higher in starches than others, and that can actually increase blood sugar levels for some individuals. So what we might do here is move on now to the grain products, which is our next section.